Hello, everybody, and welcome into another episode of Speaking Steagles, the premier Pennsylvania pro football podcast. I am Nick Vete, joined by Ricardo Martinez-Paz. We are chugging along through training camp, the preseason. I mean, it's essentially here. The Steelers have one more practice before the preseason starts. The Eagles also getting underway this weekend with their first preseason game. I mean, we've already had the Hall of Fame game. So in the eyes of some people, they may say football's already back. I mean, I don't really say football is really back until the regular season, not even the preseason. But we won't get into that. Either way, preseason is pretty much here. Training camp has been chugging along, and we've got a lot to talk about. And we are going to be discussing all of it between the Eagles and Steelers here over the next 45 minutes to an hour, maybe a little more. Who knows how long these episodes go, but that being said, Ricardo, before we dive into everything, how are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
You know what? Honestly, I can't complain. There's nothing that I can really complain about. You know, it's been a good summer, and now I get to talk Steelers and Eagles with you. So,
exactly, and I kind of agree with you on the front of that. It's not really football starting back up because I don't know about you, but I didn't watch that Hall of Fame game. But
I didn't watch the Hall of Fame game either. I was watching baseball, so I mean,
exactly,
that wasn't on my radar. And I mean, I feel like everything that was a big storyline from that game, I was aware of the next morning and did not need to watch it.
Exactly,
so, it was fine. I'll probably watch like a decent chunk of the Steelers I always watch a decent chunk of the Steelers and the Eagles preseason game. I did that last year too, but just because it is that team, and like when you follow the teams as closely as we do, like when you get to the third quarter and those third stringers are getting into the game, like it's still kind of interesting to see how they perform and if there's any one or two players that stand out from that. So
exactly.
Those games are right around the corner here, coming up this weekend. But both of these teams making some noise ahead of this last week before preseason games start here. In the inside linebacker department, towards the end of last week, the Steelers brought in Quan Alexander to add some depth to their inside linebacker room. And the Eagles also early this week brought in, I think it was actually the day before their practice, their live attendance practice at in Philadelphia. They brought in Miles Jack and Zach Cunningham. So both of these teams bolstering the inside linebacker room a little bit. Let's start with the Eagles here because it's a little bit more fresh. And like I said, Cunningham and Miles Jack both signed. I mean, I guess, Ricardo, just give us your initial reaction when you found out this news was dropping and the Eagles were bringing these two guys in.
So literally my first reaction was, oh man, is Nakobe Dean not like doing that well? But then I read up on it, and as right now he's injured. He has an ankle injury that he's dealing with. He hasn't practiced in a few days, probably a little longer. But even with Nakobe Dean healthy, he hasn't really stood out that much, which we'll get into a bit more. But yeah, I was like, okay, they are thin at the linebacker position. It's also a position they don't really value that much. So this could just be, just Cam Bodies, sort of just a veteran presence. I mean, they've been in the league for quite a while now. So I like it in terms of depth, and I don't know if they'll end up starting, but I did read that they did take first team reps in today's practice. So already getting in those quality reps with the defense, already learning Sean Desai, the defensive coordinator scheme a bit, getting involved. So yeah, I mean, right now I'm feeling okay about it. I mean, I just hope Nakobe Dean is really that guy, as we kind of talked about last episode. But yeah, right now I'm kind of chill about it, and it's so interesting. But I really want to get into this conversation, but we're gonna get to the underperforming / exceeding expectations aspect of it.
Well, and so I hear you there, and I think the one thing with the signing that, like, I agree with you. When I first heard it, I was like, "Oh boy, is this like an indictment on Nakobe Dean that like maybe he's not living up to the standard that the Eagles kind of thought they were going to get out of him this year, and kind of like ascending to the level they maybe thought he was going to grow into?" But for everything I read as well, and he's been dealing with the injury, it does seem like it's not so much on him, so much as like they just wanted to add depth. And I mean, I don't know if you know much about Christian Ellis at all, but I even read some things that said like he's been kind of outperforming Nicholas Moreau to a certain degree.
Mm-hmm.
So, now they go out and add these two pieces, and it's a guy in Miles Jack who, he kind of got ripped. I don't want to say ripped, but like I think a lot of people were maybe a little bit more harsh on Miles Jack than I was last year when he played with the Steelers. I really didn't think he did that poor of a job. I mean, ultimately the Steelers decided to part ways with him, but I mean, for the most part, I thought that he, kind of held his own in that linebacker room. And really, once we got towards the end of the season and Devin Bush was kind of on his way out and the Steelers weren't using him as much, I mean, Miles Jack really kind of was the guy down the stretch. And I mean, he's a guy that's also started 95 games in his career. So he also had 100 tackles last year total. So it's not like they're getting a guy who's, completely gone off the deep end and is completely washed. And then when you talk about Zach Cunningham, I mean, this is the guy that led the league in tackles just back in 2020. So obviously he's gone down a little bit as well. But I mean, these are two players that, one of them could potentially click and be a solid signing for the Eagles. I mean, what are you seeing as the potential upside or expectation here?
Well, if I'm looking at it from Howie Roseman's perspective, it's like kind of just throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks kind of vibe.
Dude, I was gonna bring up that exact analogy, bro. Because I remember talking about that with the safety room.
Exactly,
I think it was the last episode, maybe 2 episodes ago, but it feels like it's the same thing he's doing here. Anyway, continue your point.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure that the Eagles were linked with Miles Jack early on in free agency. So I guess there's maybe interest already there, and now we see her. So I think it's a good signing. I mean, it's 1-year deals for both, but yeah, it's like you said, it's not like he's fallen off the face of the earth. It's not like his production's been terrible. He's still a serviceable player. And as I mentioned, this linebacker room is thin, probably a bit inexperienced. Moreau, yeah, like you said, hasn't really been living up to the expectations either, taking those starting reps. So I think it's good. It's competition. I mean, you can never have. I mean, competition breeds success. We all know that.
Yeah, and I mean, just from the Steelers' perspective this year, I mean, they've got competition all over the field, and specifically at inside linebacker. We'll touch on Quan Alexander in a second here, adding more competition to another position group. But I definitely think that that competition could only elevate Nakobe Dean even more once he gets healthy, and some of these other guys. And I don't remember if Miles Jack wore the green dot last year or not, but I feel like he did. Maybe it was at one point too, as Devin Bush started to become less involved in the defense. Yeah. But for some reason, if my memory serves me correct, I feel like I remember at least a couple games he was wearing the green dot. But another thing I read, and this is the last, unless there's anything else you want to add, the last thing I'll really ask you about these two signings is neither of these guys have played in the type of system that Sean Desai is going to run, the kind of that stems from like the Vic Fangio defense. So does that concern you at all? I mean, if anything, in my mind, it says maybe, right away it'll be a little bit more of a tough adjustment, but, come a couple weeks into the season and, through the rest of the preseason, maybe they can get adjusted. I mean, both these guys are professionals at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily concerned because, yeah, they've been in the league for a while, and yeah, while they might not have that experience in that kind of defense, preseason, I mean, you're going to learn a lot in the next few weeks. They're going to learn a lot just in general about the defense. And I mean, that's kind of what preseason's for, other than, than having competition and really having those other players compete for roster spots. It's to really, because you can only do so much in practice, like in game in preseason, even if it's just, I mean, it's not a full like NFL. I mean, I guess it is an NFL game. It's just not as high stakes, but it's going to be good for them to get in all those reps whenever they can, and we'll see what happens. But I honestly, I'm cool with these moves. I like them.
Yeah, I don't think there's any situation where you can kind of look at it and be like, oh my gosh, how could the Eagles do this? I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like any move that you kind of make at this stage, unless you're maybe cutting someone unexpectedly or admitting failure on maybe a player that you realize isn't going to be a part of the future, and you cut him, and then it kind of becomes an indictment on the organization more so. But at this point, just adding depth and adding competition, I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with it. And the Steelers did that same thing, signing Quan Alexander, and we could shift over talking about that a little bit. But the Steelers came into this season kind of revamping that whole inside linebacker group, bringing in Landon Roberts, Cole Holcomb, the only holdover being Mark Robinson, who's still, a little green around the gills, if I could say, an inexperienced guy. He's only played the position of inside linebacker for a couple of years. He played running back in, some of the years he was in college. So, a guy that's still developing and, just to add some depth because God forbid anything happens to Cole Holcomb or Landon Roberts, you're all of a sudden looking at guys like Mark Robinson with inexperience or Tanner Muse, who's a career special teamer at this point, having to come in and play meaningful snaps. So to get a guy in Kwon Alexander who played a lot of snaps with the Jets last year, I think he logged over 60 tackles in his time with the Jets last season. He adds depth, and he's kind of a little bit of a blend of what you get in Holcomb and the Landon Roberts. Obviously, Holcomb more of the guy who's going to be more of the athlete in coverage, and Landon Roberts going to be the downhill run stuffer. So you get a little bit of a mix with that, and Kwon Alexander, a guy who can do both. And at the end of the day, it adds competition to the room.
Yeah. So do you think that maybe Alexander can make the roster as just a depth piece?
I'd be surprised at this point if he doesn't make the roster. I mean, it's similar to what you kind of said about like with Miles Jack, is that the Steelers were also kind of talking to Kwon Alexander in free agency. Nothing ever came about. And then, you get into training camp and deals can sometimes come through when these players realize there's nothing else available. So it was kind of that same scenario. And I'd be surprised if he doesn't, just because, Mark Robinson, I think, is a guy that they definitely still want on the roster. And I think with Nick Muse being there as that special teams guy, I see him. I could see them definitely carrying 5 inside linebackers next year. I mean, that's into the season. That's what they did last season because they had Devin Bush, Miles Jack, Mark Robinson, who didn't dress most games, but he was on the roster.
Mm-hmm.
And then they also had Robert Spillane and Marcus Allen. And Marcus Allen was kind of that special teams guy that I think Tanner Muse will take over for. And Spillane was that depth piece that now I think Kwon Alexander is going to kind of fit into. And I think he is going to see the field on defense in some pretty meaningful snaps throughout this season.
Yeah, so sort of similar to Miles Jack. I mean, hopefully use those preseason games to really get in those reps. But I'm also just thinking he was drafted by the Bucks, right? In 2018, I believe it was.
Kwon Alexander, are you? Well, I know I don't know exactly what year he was drafted, but I know he's still only 28, which kind of took me by surprise because I thought he was older than he actually is. But still, as in the NFL landscape, I mean, 28 years old. He's not necessarily old at this point.
No, yeah, that's still fairly. I mean, you could argue that's still in their prime, maybe sort of towards a later stage of that, but yeah, no, drafted in 2015 by the Bucks. I remember him being really good with the Bucks. Now, I'm not saying that he's gonna ever get back to that form because injuries have kind of plagued him, but anything close to that, I guess, would be, I mean, pretty nice for the Steelers.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have super high expectations for him other than to just kind of be a depth piece and, when called upon, make some of the plays. I mean, he led the league in tackles once in his time in Tampa Bay. I'm not expecting anything near that. I'm not expecting him to even be, in the Pro Bowl discussion. I'm just saying, hey, this is a nice veteran depth piece, a guy who's been a starter in this league before, and a guy who played good snaps with the Jets last year that you're now adding to your room to be a contributor on defense when his name is called. And, should there be an injury, he can, I'm pretty confident with him being able to step into that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So both of those signings, I mean, we'll see how the preseason kind of unfolds here and these guys get acclimated to being with their new teams, both on the Eagles and the Jets. So we'll transition now. And a fun idea that we had kind of talked about this last week leading up to this was, now that we're kind of a couple weeks into training camp, we're getting into the preseason year. And I think this is something that we may even, depending on how much news we have from show to show, maybe we'll keep this going throughout the next couple weeks. But it's kind of a little bit of stock up, stock down, through training camp so far, what players are kind of exceeding expectations or meeting expectations, and what players are maybe falling a little short of expectations. So I think calling it stock up, stock down is a nice way to do it. And and we'll get into it. So what do we want to start first? Do we want to start with the good or the bad?
We gotta start with the bad, man.
Let's start with the
negative out of the way.
Let's start with the bad. And why don't you give us a couple guys through Eagles training camp so far that their stock is a little bit down, that you're a little bit down.
Okay, well, I'll get to the absolute.
Hey, you're the one that wanted to start with the bad here, Ricardo. Okay.
No, but I have the absolute worst one. So cornerback Greedy Williams for the Eagles signed this past offseason. I don't know if the Eagles really had any expectations for him to. I mean, probably to at least be the top or one of the top two backup corners. To Darius Slay, James Bradbury, Avonte Maddox. I mean, those three obviously are going to start. But Greedy Williams has a horrible, horrible camp. It's just the most penalized corner on the roster. It just, I swear, every time I read something on training camp, every day, it's he got flagged for being too grabby. Yeah, so he's just been so poor. At this point, I mean, even I don't remember who wrote this, but one of the writers said that he's definitely going to be in like the first round of cuts. That is how bad he has been. So,
Wow, I didn't even realize it was that bad for Greedy Williams. I mean, when you think back to this offseason, like this is a guy who, before Darius Slay was, brought back and before James Bradbury was re-signed, like I don't remember exactly how the timeline unfolded, but it felt like he was going to have like maybe even a little bit large of a role than we anticipated. So, I
yeah,
mean, thank goodness the Eagles were able to bring back those two corners and they drafted Ringo and,
yep,
they've got a couple other guys there. We'll dive into their depth a little more later when we get into some positional breakdown stuff. But like, man,
yeah.
I did not expect you to come on here and say, yeah, first round of cuts. I mean, you could, maybe chalk it up to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just been that bad. I would have expected at least a bit, like, I don't know, but just a bit more competent and not being the grabbiest player on the field, the most penalized dude on the field, but it's just how it's turned out. So, um, yeah, I don't really expect him to make the roster. If
Yeah,
I'd be
and I
shocked at
mean,
this point,
maybe he
but
was brought in a little bit because he still has that pedigree where, he was a guy that was drafted in the second round, so a
exactly.
relatively early pick. But
Yeah.
I mean, really, I guess the development never panned out. And I mean, lucky for the Eagles, they have other options they can turn to. But
Yeah,
man,
exactly.
first round of cuts. I mean, do you think there's anything if he balls out in the first preseason game, or do you think there's a shot he could still find his way onto this roster?
I
I
don't
mean,
know,
we'll keep an
man.
eye on his
That's
stock going forward here over the next couple days, and depending how long he can stay with the team. But
if he balls out potentially, because I guess it's just practice, and you can only, like I said, see so much, do so much. But yeah, if he balls out, which I'd be shocked if he did, potentially, as I don't know. I just don't think it's gonna happen, but we'll get to that part when it comes. Yeah, so that was the ugliest one by far. I'll give you one more, and we already talked about him, and Nicholas Morrow, or Moreau, who hasn't been terrible necessarily. He's just been underwhelming. Um, and I kind of say that with Nakobe Dean. I could put them two together because they're both linebackers, but I'm going to stick more with Moreau. It's just he's been losing first team reps over the last week and change. So he's been losing that to. I mean, the Eagles are even trying out Nolan Smith, their rookie, their first round rookie, the second of two. Second of two, at the off ball linebacker position. So, and they're also Christian Ellis has been standing out a bit more than he has. So it's not a good look. I mean, again, a 1 year deal for him, but still, man. I mean, I feel like part of the reason the Eagles brought in Miles Jack and why am I blanking on who else they brought in?
Zach Cunningham.
Zach Cunningham is because of Moreau, I guess, because it's just he hasn't really been doing that well either. Nakobe Dean, I'm also going to throw him in here because he's been injured for a week now. Just he still also hasn't really been standing out in a good way, not in a negative way either. Just hasn't been making a lot of flashy plays, if at all any. So, yeah, it's disappointing to see, but it's also not surprising considering how little the Eagles value the linebacker position.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting too because this is a guy who, I mean, he did have 116 sacks last year, Nicholas Moreau, with the Bears. But then I was thinking about it. It's like, the Bears let this guy go in free agency, and then they go out and they actually do sign TJ
T.J.
Edwards.
Edwards, yeah,
And they also brought in Tremaine Edmonds from the Bills. So maybe that kind of connects the dots a little bit. I mean, obviously the organizations valued the inside linebacker position differently, but
yes,
I feel like Howie Roseman in the past has taken chances at this position on guys like TJ Edwards or guys like Kazir White, who he signs for like a 1-year deal. And it's like, hey, let's see if it hits. And, maybe he's realizing a little bit, hey, this isn't going to work. So we're going to pivot off of this, bring in a couple other veterans to compete here and see what Nakobe Dean can do when he gets back healthy. So maybe it's not the worst thing in the world. And who knows, maybe he gets into game action. And he really kind of finds himself a little bit, but his stock down right now, I guess, according to what you've heard and read so far.
Yeah, pretty. I mean, not as egregious as Greedy Williams, but still not the best either. But yeah, so those are the two players I would say that stock down for sure.
That you had for stock down. All right, well, that works well because I also had 2 players for stock down, so I kept it to just the 2 here. And I don't know why I keep getting my notes mixed up. This happened to me right before we hopped on too, but for my I remember the guys off the top of my head. I just don't know what I did with the notes here.
Hey man, when you got so much to talk about, it's easy to get lost in the notes.
I guess so, but this is also all right, here we go. Now I think I'm starting to see. Now I see what I did. All right, here. All right, notes are back together. So first one I'm going to start off with here on the offensive line is Kevin Dotson, a guy. I think I brought it up on my last show, but obviously with the Steelers having James Daniels from last year and bringing in Isaac Seumalo, like Kevin Dotson was going to have to do a lot to, I think there was never really a question of, all right, can this guy, still be a starter? That was kind of going to go to Daniels and Seumalo. But the question was, is this guy just going to hand the job over? And I was like, no, let's see Kevin Dotson kind of work and maybe have one of his better camps of his career and really kind of prove to the coaches like, hey, yeah, I know we brought in these other guys, but I'm ready to go. I'm the next man up. I'm a ready available option should anything happen on the interior of this offensive line. And I just haven't seen that fight at all. It's not that he's had necessarily a bad camp, like he's getting burned a lot, but it's just underwhelming. This is his 3rd season with the Steelers now. And it's just like I expected more out of him. I expected him to have more of a fight, more of a push, and I expected to hear his name being called a bit more. So he really hasn't stood out at all while, Seumalo is one of the best, was the big free agent pickup at the guard position. And James Daniels is having, from everything I've read, a much better camp than he had last year with the Steelers where he was adjusting to the system. And obviously he finished the year really strong. So Kevin Dotson's stock is a bit down in my book.
Yeah. So, it's still early in training camp, but it's obviously not a good thing either, but do you think if he continues this way, he might not make the roster? Or you think they still keep him around anyway?
I don't think he's a cut because, again, he hasn't played bad. I'm curious to see how he plays in like the actual preseason games.
Yeah.
And if he looks decent to all right, there's going to be some teams out there that, whether it's through injuries or just offensive linemen having some value, that may see a guy like Kevin Dotson or willing to trade, a later round draft pick for him or something along those lines. So that's what I really think could be potentially more of an avenue. But when it comes to just a straight cut, I don't see that happening. Nate Herbig is a guy that I considered for my stock up, but I decided not to give it to him. So I'll talk about him anyway, but he's played really well. And obviously he can play both guard spot and he's been making himself more versatile, taking snaps at center too. So if the Steelers decided, hey, we're getting some sort of trade offer for Kevin Dotson here, we're cool with the rest of our depth in Herbig. I can see them going that avenue, but I really don't see them just straight cutting him, at least at this stage. Like I said, it hasn't been an egregious camp. His stock is just down in my book because he hasn't done anything that, I've said really warrants him being like, all right, we got to hold on to this guy because he really wants this job as next in line for, a guard spot should anything happen.
Right. So lack of sort of desire, sort of earning that position even.
Yeah. It feels in my book like Nate Herbig has had the better camp and, granted he is more of a veteran, but he's only been in the system now for, these couple of months that he's been a Pittsburgh Steeler.
Right.
And he's showed his versatility. He's shown a lot of things that I feel like the organization could value more than maybe what Kevin Dotson brings to the table, other than Kevin Dotson's just pure experience under Pat Meyer and in the system.
Right. That's totally fair.
So we will see. I do think that the trade avenue is more likely than just them flat out cutting him. I still think he's too good of a player to just release. So
right.
Especially if Herbig can be the backup center and you don't need to keep somebody who's just purely a center. So that's where I stand on him. And then my second guy whose stock I'm a little bit down on. And again, it's the same thing. The Steelers haven't had anybody like Greedy Williams, who was like an egregious stock down. I'm just being honest here.
Yeah.
There isn't even anybody like Nicholas Moreau, who was, maybe a big time signing or not even a big time signing, but just somebody they brought in that hasn't been good. But I will say a guy that they brought back in free agency, and signed him to a 3-year deal was Larry Ogunjobi. And it's not that he had a bad season last year. It's not that he's had a bad camp. I'm not saying that's the case. But again, just a guy that I feel like has gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit and hasn't really stood out in any way. When it's a guy like Cameron Hayward or a guy like TJ Watt, that I don't need to hear things every day from them because they're proven guys who are top defensive players in the NFL who have been ranked as top 100 players in the NFL before. But for Larry Ogunjobi, like that's a guy that I want to see like, hey, let's see you having a good camp. Like let me get excited about you being that real, 1-2 punch with Cameron Hayward at the defensive end spot. I mean, the Steelers weren't great against the run last year.
Yeah.
And part of my optimism was Larry Ogunjobi getting better in his second year in the system, another year removed from that major foot injury he had. But I just haven't seen that to that point. And with how much, I guess, kind of lack of depth the Steelers have in that kind of defense against the rush, I would have liked to see a little bit more of a camp. But again, it's nothing bad. I'm not trying to overreact to it or anything.
Right.
His stock just is a little bit down compared to some of the other guys.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely not the most it's not that encouraging to see, especially when you think about the contract he signed, 3 years, $28.75 million. Like you said, you would definitely like to see a guy who got paid, be a bit better in training camp and have a good camp at least. The
Steelers invested in him for the next couple of years. So they're going to be counting on him to be a real presence on that defensive line. It just hasn't been there. There's nothing that stood out in this training camp to me with him. So a little bit of a stock down, but let's talk about the positives a little bit. Why don't you give me the couple of Eagles whose stock you have up?
Stock up. So there are a couple, definitely more than stock down, but let's see. I would say I'm going to go with a different corner. It's funny we're going to be talking about corners, but I'm already talking like in later on, but I'm already bringing them up. But Josh Jobe, I don't know if it's Jobe or Joby. I think it's Jobe, but he's been pretty good as I've been reading lately. He's been taking James Bradbury's been out dealing with a groin injury, so and Jobe has been the first man up to really take in those first team reps. So that's really encouraging to see. I believe he's in his second year. Second year. Zach McPherson's is the one in the third. Zach McPherson's the one I thought maybe would take that top backup position, but it turns out he's taking more reps in the slot. And so Joe will probably play more outside if, God forbid, any major injuries happen outside of James Bradbury or Darius Slay. But seeing that from young players is definitely good to see. There was something else I had about him, but he would definitely. It's encouraging to see that a young player like him would be, taking command and really, solidifying himself as that top cornerback position. So that's my first one.
I mean, he's seizing the opportunity with Greedy Williams struggling to kind of step up and be a depth piece in this Eagles, defensive area in the Eagles cornerback room. And I mean, wasn't he a guy that was in training camp last year? I don't remember if he stuck on the roster throughout the season, but I feel like I remember him being in camp last year, right?
Yeah, he was. Yeah. So
I don't know if he wrote out on the practice squad or whatnot, but I mean, hey, he's developing and having a good camp. And when you string together good days like that and your stock goes up, I mean, that's something that can trend you in the direction towards, possibly getting a wild card spot. And with you saying his stock is up, it'll definitely be a name to keep an eye on in that first preseason game.
Yeah, he's been making a handful of plays, interceptions in practice. So that's always good to see. More positive than negative, definitely. So now I'm going to switch it over to the offense because I've been sticking more on defense this entire time. Quez Watkins, the wide receiver. I didn't think I'd bring his name up in this, but considering how underwhelming he was last season, but it turns out he's actually having a pretty good training camp to start. Making pretty contested catches. I mean, he just looks sharper than he did last season, which is encouraging to see. And, especially after the season he had and some of the costly drops he had in specific games like the Commanders and in the Super Bowl. I mean, yeah, it's good to see that he's bouncing back, that he's in a positive sort of mindset. So, yeah, I mean, he was a player that I thought the Eagles might cut or trade this
Wow.
this
Yeah.
offseason because of how underwhelming he was and how many errors he had, how many mistakes he had during the regular season. So it's a good sign for him, and I think with that wide receiver 3 position still very much wide open. He was that last year. Obviously, Devontae Smith and AJ Brown being the top two. It seems like Quez Watkins is really taking a stranglehold of that third position, which is great to see. So yeah, that's definitely better than how I felt about him last year. But
Yeah, no, that's
yeah,
good to hear that he's bouncing back and having a good camp. I mean, I think he's a guy that definitely elevates that room, and just to add another third dynamic alongside those two receivers you touched on, and Dallas Goedert for that matter too.
oh
But
yeah,
just to have that kind of like explosive weapon in the slot, if he can get back to that like he was 2 years ago, that would certainly be a boost. Because yeah, last year definitely was a bit of a setback for him.
it was rough for him. But yeah, no, it's a good sign. Hopefully, it stays this way. But those are my two players I have for stock up.
All right, sounds good. Sounds good. So I had a couple of honorable mentions that I'm just gonna. These are guys I just thought about. I thought about Calvin Austin. He started off a little slow. Kate has come on strong in recent weeks. I didn't want to give it to him. I also thought about Kenny Robinson, who's in the safety room. He's had 3 interceptions leading camp so far. Didn't want to give it to him, and I brought up Nate Herbig earlier at the offensive line. But the first guy I'm gonna say. And, he's number 2 on this list, but I want to save the main guy who's had the biggest camp for second year. But Joey Porter Jr., the rookie, has actually had a really good camp so far. And, I mean, I know that, people who maybe don't follow the Steelers, as closely as we do may, point to some of the videos that have come out of George Pickens kind of, I don't even want to say cooking him, but just making spectacular catches over him. May be like, oh, man, like that doesn't look good. But Joey Porter has gone out there and he's competed with George Pickens and the rest of these wide receivers within this room and has really held his own pretty well. And I'm a guy that wasn't crazy about the pick when it happened. Now, again, I still recognized it was value for where they got him at the start of the second round, but he has not looked bad, has certainly held his own. And he already has a couple picks in training camp as well. So, even just talking about that play, that George Pickens, everybody's seen it by now, where George Pickens essentially jumps around him and makes the catch while falling backwards. I mean, Joey Porter Jr. was in great position.
Yeah, exactly.
That was just purely George Pickens being a athletic freak at the wide receiver position.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you can't even really fault Joey Porter Jr. there. And it was actually Grady Brown, I believe he's the defensive backs coach, that Joey Porter Jr. talked to him after and said, this is what he said to Joey Porter after the play. He said, quote, make him make a great catch every time. And I completely agree with that logic. I mean, that was fantastic coverage. And if he's going to be sticky on receivers like that, not every wide receiver is going to make crazy catches like that the way George Pickens does. So he's honestly looked really good in camp, and he's gone up against these top wide receivers of the Steelers and hasn't looked bad. And when you talk about some of these other corners around the league that are rookies, I mean, I know Deonte Banks with the Giants hasn't had a great campaign so far in training camp as a rookie. So, there's guys that haven't really taken off in the same magnitude here that Joey Porter has. And I feel his stock is up. I feel he stood out a little bit. And I'm excited to see what he brings to this first preseason game.
Yeah, first off, that catch was crazy. And also, Joey Porter Jr. was in great position. I'm like, what more do you want him to do there?
And he even got his head around a little bit. It's not like there was any shot that his back was to the ball and stuff like that. And some people even said that might have been, if anything, offensive pass interference on George Pickens.
Yeah. But no, that's great to see that he's doing this well.
You know me. If he was having a bad camp, I would be the first one to let you know.
Yeah, you would be all over that.
and that hasn't been the case. And I'm giving him his props. And if he proves me wrong, and, obviously I don't want to go out saying anything bold here. We haven't even seen a preseason game yet, but he's looked very good so far in training camp, and I'm happy for him. And I think that he is going through camp with a bit of a chip on his shoulder after not going in the first round.
Exactly. I was about to say, because he didn't go in the first round, it's probably it serves as more motivation for him to prove all those who passed on him wrong. So that's great to see.
It is great to see. I'm happy for him. And you know what? We don't have to go far to talk about the other guy whose stock is really up with the Steelers, because it's that guy who made the fantastic catch. It's George Pickens. It's just like he's got the raw athletic ability. And I mean, like, he can just do it all at the wide receiver position. He really can. And he's put it together this training camp. He's really developed a connection with Kenny Pickett, I think even more so than Pickett has with Deontay Johnson. And if he really takes this step in year 2, this could be a really formidable wide receiver duo for Kenny Pickett to throw to. And, I want to get into George Pickens here just a little bit because he has been, putting his name out there a bit, really in the couple months, even before training camp and obviously into the start of training camp, just saying stuff. So I'll go through the timeline here. There's just 3 events where he was saying things in the media. May 30th, he said he was snubbed from the Pro Bowl in 2022 when looking back on the season and talking. And then he said that he wants, as far as his goals for this year, said he wants both to get to the Pro Bowl and the Super Bowl. So, some pretty lofty expectations. And he also brought up the fact that he wants to improve his run after the catch ability, which is all very valid. Mm-hmm. So fast forward to July 31st. He's in an interview with The Ringer at the end of July here. And he was talking about himself. And he said that he's the type of player you'd make in like a create a player mode, like as if it were almost like a video game, saying, he's got all the skill sets and the athletic intangibles you'd want in a player. And you know what? He even said, like, he's the type of player that thinks every play on offense should go his way. And when he's not, that's why you see him playing so angry. And he gets after it in the blocking game because he's mad that it's not his number being called in the pass game. And Tomlin's actually even said, like, he loves that attitude of his players. He'd rather have to kind of reel them in a little bit than try to motivate them to give more.
Yeah.
So that was what he said July 31st. And then this week he was on the All Things Covered podcast with Brian McFadden and Patrick Peterson, who's, still an active player with the Steelers, actually. And they were talking to him about a bunch of different stuff. It was actually a really interesting 10-minute interview if you have time to watch it, because he gets into a bunch of stuff like giving out his like top 5 receivers of all time. I don't know if you saw it. But
I did see the top 5. I was intrigued by Michael Crabtree and being included in that. Or I think
that was definitely all right. So if you saw that, I guess you don't really need to watch it again. But that was the main thing. I mean, but they were talking about his goals, and he said he wants 1,000 to 1,100 receiving yards, and he wants 10 touchdowns. So, I mean, it's not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, he had 800 yards last year, and I think he had 4 TDs off the top of my head. I don't remember the touchdowns for sure, but he was right at 100 yards. But, when I just look at kind of what he's saying for his goals, he wants to get better with run after the catch. I think that's very valid. We can catch the ball anywhere it's thrown. So, like, extending plays a little bit, running for more yards. He only had about 100 yards after the catch last season. So I think that's a very real aspect of his game to work on. Mm-hmm. And, the one thing that I have to say about kind of the actual stat numbers he's put out there is last year, there was only 4 wide receivers who had 1,000 reception yards and 10 touchdowns. That was Travis Kelce, A.J. Brown, Stephon Diggs, and Devontae Adams. So, I mean, if he could join that company, I mean, we're talking about a big leap here. And I'm just curious your thoughts on all of this right now. I feel like I've been talking about this a lot. He's had a great camp so far, but he's talking a lot in the media right now, setting a lot of expectations and discussing himself.
See, I feel like that's a good thing to have on offense because you kind of need those players, those really like the confident ones, the vocal ones. Like, I'm not going to say he's a leader right now, but he's kind of trending in that direction. Just like he's got that swagger to him. You kind of, I don't know, you need those in the locker room, especially. I mean, I feel like Deontay Johnson's not the most outspoken either. So I love watching Pickens play. It's so fun to watch. I'm sure you do too. Just the first thing that comes to mind is that catch against the Browns, I believe it was. That ridiculous catch. I think that was the catch of the year, or the Jefferson one. But it either way, it was still ridiculous. No, it's I think it's good. As long I think those goals are realistic, at least the Pro Bowl one. Super Bowl, that's a different story. Let's not go overboard here. But I like it though. He's aiming high.
Well, I think it's interesting the way you discuss it, that he plays with that swagger and that's kind of what he's carrying. I just think it's a fine line that he has to walk here between the swagger and turning into a diva wide receiver. And I think that was a line that Antonio Brown walked for a long time in his Steelers career. And sometimes it went back and forth with both. And really, I think Antonio Brown did a good job through really his early years of his career into his real superstardom of having that swagger. But once things started to go haywire a little bit, and Ben Roethlisberger started to kind of decline a little bit, and Antonio Brown started to decline a little bit, it turned into more of a diva aspect. And the comparison that immediately comes to mind for me dates back to about a year ago, maybe a little bit more than that. Last year, talking about that on this podcast, you know where I'm going with this. When Chase Claypool set his goals for last season, and he was saying that he was going to get 1,300 receiving yards, and he was going to get 10 touchdowns, and saying that he's a top 3 receiver in the NFL, and it just concerns me a little bit when he didn't live up to that. And it's not even that he was necessarily bad in the locker room as a result of that. I can't fault him for that. I don't remember him ever being outspokenly a distraction or anything like that.
Yeah,
but he clearly didn't meet those goals, and now all of a sudden you've got George Pickens who's saying similar stat lines. And when also asked about his top 5 receivers all time, I don't know if you saw this aspect, but before he said Michael Crabtree at number 5, he jokingly said himself. Which,
yeah.
I mean, I get it's jokingly, but again, you can tell it's in the back of the mind that he's a bit full of himself. And again, that's just the wide receiver position. I just want to make sure he's walking that fine line of diva and swagger. And I hope that he stays on the swagger side, and I hope that he delivers with some of these goals he set forth for himself.
Right, but I think there's a little bit of a difference between the two players in Claypool and Pickens. I think Pickens is backing it up, considering you said, he's had a good training camp. I don't remember Chase Claypool necessarily had a good one last year, but still, from the things we've read this past year, even just from the Bears, that his work ethic's been poor. Chase Claypool, I'm referring to here.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't think that's the case with Pickens at this point in time. I hope it's never that I hope that's never the case, but I think that's the difference, work ethic versus like mentality. Like, you can say all these things. Obviously, you got to back it up on the field. And I think as of right now, he's backing it up. But it's, again, right now it's tough because obviously the season hasn't started. But the 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns, I feel like that's realistic. I don't know about how you feel about that, but I think it is realistic because
I think that the 1,000 yards, 1,100 yards is more realistic than perhaps the 10 touchdowns. I mean, Deontay Johnson didn't have a single touchdown last year. Like, that's going to revert back to the mean. Like,
right.
I do believe Kenny Pickett's going to throw for more touchdown passes, but this was also a team that ran the ball a lot, especially around the goal line. And, they still have Pat Freiermuth who's going to get involved, and they just drafted big Darnell Washington, who is going to be mainly used in goal line situations because of his big frame. So I think the ball is going to get spread around down there too. Defenses may also key in on him in the red zone, but I think that if he gets 1,000 yards, I think that's definitely more attainable than the touchdowns per se. I think Pro Bowl is also something that could be attainable. Yeah. I think you also bring up a good point, because we do have to recognize there is a distinction between the skill set of Chase Claypool and George Pickens and kind of their work ethic and what they can do. And also, I think an important factor in that as well is the scheme that they're playing in. Like, Chase Claypool, it was no secret. He was kind of an odd duck in the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver scheme last year. They tried to kind of shove him into being that slot receiver, and it didn't work. And it eventually led to him being traded. There's no question that they're going to line George Pickens up on the outside and let him go to work as kind of that outside receiver. There's nothing that's going to be in question there. And he's going to have every opportunity to succeed. So I think the yards is definitely feasible. And I think that connection with Kenny Pickett is apparent. One other thing I think is interesting. He had 800 yards receiving last year. FanDuel has his line for over-under receiving yards on the season set at 775. So, this isn't a gambling podcast or anything like that, but maybe something that could be some value. I'm just saying.
I'm taking the over on that. What do you mean?
Honestly, it could be some serious value there. And if he is anything close to his goals that he set, I mean, he may soar past that.
Man, I'm putting my money on that right now as we speak. But seriously, that's so low for him.
It's lower than what he put up last year. And that's
crazy.
Granted, Chase Claypool declined from his rookie year to his second season. But again, I talked about the scheme fit and just everything that was going on there. So, and obviously last year it was a rookie quarterback compared to Ben Roethlisberger and Claypool's first year. But Yeah, again, to revert back to the ultimate point here, George Pickens' stock is up, and he's been talking a lot. And I'm very confident in him. I'm very confident in him, and you know what? I do have confidence in him that he will kind of put up some of these kind of stats. But anyway,
Yeah,
that's enough on George Pickens. Let's move on now to really a fun part of this that we've been doing. We did this last year where we kind of set these position previews where we break them down, set some expectations, kind of analyze the depth at each one. And Ricardo, I actually by chance was just digging through some of my stuff in one of my backpacks today and found this. I swear to God, I did not have this at the ready, but this is from
my
last year. We kept track of it all the different position groups that we analyzed. And I think it'd be fun, real quick, 5 minutes to just kind of go through this and see if we were kind of right about our preview and expectations, if we were right about which position group was better for each team. And I mean, I'll start real quick with the Eagles here. We said the D-line, the corners, the offensive line, the wide receiver, tight ends, and the quarterback were all going to be better. I think we're in agreement they were all better last year.
Yes, absolutely.
So, I mean, as for the Steelers, the 4 positions we gave them, one of them was special teams. I mean, neither team I feel like really stood out as far as the return game went.
Not really.
I felt like the punt. I mean, the punting was kind of lackluster both ways. But
yes.
I mean, we'll get into the special teams a little bit here. But Chris Boswell just had a bad down year last year, so I think the Eagles had better special teams play. When it came to safety, I mean, I think it's a little bit of a toss up. We gave it to the Steelers. I mean, I think the Steelers' safety play was pretty good last year. I mean,
I would say so too.
I mean, it's hard here when we're talking about the Eagles because it's not like they were deficient anywhere. They made it to the Super Bowl.
Right. Yeah.
running back position. I mean, the Steelers didn't really find themselves running the football until the second half of the year. Meanwhile, Miles Sanders had a career year. So, I think that also speaks to the offensive line of the Eagles, which was arguably the best in football.
Absolutely.
And then as far as the linebackers go, I mean, the inside linebacker play of the Steelers really wasn't that good. TJ Watt was hurt for a majority of the year. I mean, you got to give it to the Eagles there as well.
I mean, I guess TJ Edwards was really the one who carried the linebacking room, but yeah, okay. I mean, so you're saying everything pretty much except for safety was the Eagles.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about a team that, was a couple. I mean, they made it to the Super Bowl. They were a bad pass interference call away from going to overtime or getting the ball back in the Super Bowl with a chance to go down and score. I mean, the Eagles were damn good last year. The Steelers missed the playoffs. So
okay, valid. That's fair.
Yeah, and I mean the Eagles did have a really talented roster, but anyway, that was last year. Let's move on to this year, and let's start with the special teams, and let's start that with the Eagles here. So why don't you? I don't know where you want to go to start here on special teams, but I'll let you kind of take it wherever.
I'm not even kidding with you right now. I'm pretty sure the special teams unit is the same exact one as last year.
You think it's going to be well? I was going to ask you. I mean, they did bring in that the kid from Kansas State, the punter, Ty Zetner or whatever his name was.
Yeah, but apparently,
I don't know if anything has happened there.
No, Sipas has been punting better, and he's had better hang time. Oh my God, that's when you have a lot of time when you're looking at hang time and stuff like that. But man, yeah. So at least in that category, it looks like Aaron Sipas is going to win that battle.
Okay.
I mean, I really hope that the Eagles bring in someone else, like some other veteran, maybe even after all the cuts. Every team does their cuts, because Sipas was just atrocious. I mean, at least from the eye test, it just was not good.
Well, I mean, I even have some numbers for you. I mean, he was 6th to last in average punt distance last year, and he was tied for 27th in punts inside the 20. So, I mean, not what you want, especially when, special teams is a real part of the game, and especially the punters are such a weapon when you can consistently pin guys inside their own 20, and he was tied for 27th in that aspect. So, really, the Eagles weren't getting any help from Sipas in that department.
I mean, look no further than that one shanked punt in the Super Bowl, and then the Chiefs scored to take the lead. I mean, that was just that pretty much summed up him as a player and his season. I mean, just how poor he was. But yeah, as things stand, it's going to be Sipas
I
taking
don't
that.
know, and the thing is, I don't even know if you can really expect much to change. This is
No,
just
exactly.
who Aaron Cepas is, and like unless you bring in someone else, this is what you're getting out of your punter.
Yeah, it's
And
it's what
I'm
we
honestly
got.
surprised, like the amount that Howie Roseman has done to improve this roster, even mid-season. Last year bringing in the defensive tackles, now bringing in the inside linebackers and Jack and Cunningham. Like you'd think he'd really go out and invest a couple $1 million to bring in a legit veteran punter to compete with Aaron Cepas, not some kid named Zettner from Kansas State.
Exactly. Like that's the least you could do is bring in someone else to at least be average. I don't know. This dude wasn't even average last year. Like you said, he was just bottom half the league in like every statistical category. God, whatever. I'm getting heated over a punter. That's oh my god. I mean, I guess that's
Get
a
this
good thing,
man a
right?
punter, for crying out loud, Howie Roseman. Get someone who can kick the ball.
That's all you do, and hold the ball. Maybe
This team is fantastic in every other department. Find someone who can drop the ball and boot it further than 30 yards.
I guess that's a testament to the rest of the team that I'm getting heated over a damn punter. The rest of the roster is fine, I guess.
I mean, it's
Oh
just that
man,
time of the year, man. It's just that time of the year.
just aggravating. I've been holding this in for ages, but it had to come out eventually. Um, but yeah, so that's the punter situation. So how do we want to do this? You want me to just go through the entire special teams? Is
Yeah,
that
why don't you go on to Jake Elliott or the returners or anything else you want to touch on special teams? Then I'll go to special teams before we
Yeah, I
get into some other
mean,
stuff.
Jake Elliott, again, another good season, great season last year. I mean, he didn't kick as much as he did the season before because obviously the Eagles were scoring more touchdowns, so really
It's simple
wasn't
as that.
of much use. Yeah. So I mean, still good as always. Yet okay, punt returner, kick returner situation is kind of
Real quick on
similar.
Jake Elliott. I mean, he
Yeah.
also did. He led the league in like because the Eagles were scoring so much. He made 51 of his 53 PAT attempts. So props to him for that.
Yeah, that
When he was on the field, he was kicking it through. Also, I actually just stumbled upon this. He made every single kick, whether a field goal or a PAT, through the Eagles playoff run. So he was getting it done when it mattered as well. But
yeah, I mean, clutch.
there's nothing to worry about with Jake Elliott per se.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So-
Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead and what you were saying with the.
See, there's someone who was kicking and doing his damn job. But anyway, again, I digress.
Howie Roseman, get one of those, but for the punting job.
Literally, um, punt and kick return situation similar to last year. Britton Covey is being tried out at both positions. I mean, Boston Scott. I believe he was the kick returner for most of the season. And it looks like he might be taking that position again, which is fine. And then obviously he'll be useful when they play the Giants. So, I mean, again, not really all that flashy in terms of punt and kick returner, but I guess serviceable. Again, not real. I mean, they were kind of close to average. Actually, I think more towards the bottom half. I don't have the exact numbers on that in terms of return yardage and all the other statistics, but they were just fine. I think Boston Scott was, probably the most consistent kick returner that the Eagles had. Quez Watkins is still being tried out there. I don't think that's going to work out again, but so really that's it on the special teams front. Like I said at the beginning, it's pretty much the same situation, other than maybe a couple players being tried out here and there, but it's going to end up being those same five. So yeah, we turn it over to the Steelers.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, we'll start with the punters again here. Different from the Eagles, Omar Khan actually did go out and bring in some competition for Braden Mann because as bad as Aaron Cepas was, Presley Harvin, I said Cepas was like six to worst in that average yards per punt. Well, Presley Harvin was fourth to worst. So it could be worse for you guys. Also not good at pitting the ball inside the opponent's 20, but they bring in Braden Mann, who's been competing. I honestly couldn't tell you who's winning that battle. I mean, the only indications the Steelers did release their first depth chart, and Presley Harvin was still at number 1 on that depth chart. I mean, really when it comes down to one way or another, I think this is a competition that's just going to go through camp. And really, I think the biggest thing is going to be, who is more efficient when it actually comes to, executing in preseason games.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Braden Mann had a decent year last year. He was middle of the pack in average punt distance. So
Still better.
if he can make something happen and he can kind of replicate that, it could be an upgrade over Presley Harvin. I mean, he played the whole year last year with the Jets, so it wouldn't shock me if Braden Mann won this battle and overtook Presley Harvin. I mean, it's the same thing as CPOS with Presley Harvin. I feel like you know what you have with him at this point. We've been waiting a couple years now to see him take the next step, and he just hasn't done that. So if Braden Mann beats him out, Braden Mann beats him out.
Yeah, I mean, see, at least your GM did something,
Yeah.
brought in competition, and like you said, average in that one stat, that's still better than Presley Harvin.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I said this at the top, and we'll get into it as we go position to position throughout the next couple weeks here, doing these previews. But the Steelers have competition all over, and even at the place kicker position with Chris Boswell, a guy who's been a Pro Bowler before, who's been one of the best kickers in the league. They even brought in a guy named BT Potter. I don't really know anything about him because it's more just to have a little bit of competition. I mean, he's not going to win the job.
No.
You paid Chris Boswell big money to be your kicker. Like, he's going to be the guy.
Yeah.
But the last 3 seasons prior to 2022, Boswell was 90% or better on field goal percentage. 2022 was a down year for him. He was 71%. Granted, he only attempted 28 field goals. He did play in just 12 games. He dealt with that injury for a little bit as well during the season. So I'm expecting a bounce back year. I'm really not worried about Chris Boswell. And, I think he can bounce back and be in the upper half of kickers in the NFL, if not one of the best kickers in the NFL. I mean, he's one of the most accurate all time. So I'm perfectly content with what the Steelers have in Chris Boswell. And I've got faith that he'll bounce back.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't know if you have anything to add. Otherwise, I could just go on to the kick returners.
No, yeah. Let's move on.
So then, I mean, again, it's kind of similar. The Steelers are kind of running back what they had last year, where they, kind of tried out a couple different guys, and they still have Gunnar Olszewski on the roster. He's a guy that could potentially get cut this year because I really don't see his value outside of, being a return man. And Calvin Austin was actually listed on that same depth chart ahead of Gunnar Olszewski. So maybe that alludes to something. And, if Calvin Austin can be that guy who's an explosive playmaker downfield and also return kicks and punts for you reliably, then, I could see Gunnar Olszewski kind of becoming dispensable here. The one thing I'll say about this position, and I think you may be able to relate to this, but like the Eagles had Ray McLeod 2 years ago, or excuse me, the Steelers had Ray McLeod 2 years ago, and he was one of the best kick punt returners in the league, even got after it a little bit on the offensive side of the ball. And the Steelers let him walk in free agency after that 2021 season to go to the 49ers. And you really kind of don't realize how important a guy who can, professionally field punt returns and, kind of make plays in the kick return game is until you don't have one. And the Steelers kind of lacked on that a little bit last year. And now that Calvin Austin's healthy, I'm just hoping that he can, be a sure thing back there. I don't need the explosive plays from him. I just need to know that he's going to, do his job, catch the ball, not cause any turnovers anytime the ball's in the air towards him. And I don't know. We'll see if Gunnar Olszewski can do anything to stay on the roster. It's going to come, through this return department if he's going to stay with the Steelers somehow.
Yeah, I mean, both teams pretty similar situations, at least in terms of who is projected to be starting or be on the roster. But yeah, I mean, I also just thought of this. The Eagles, this is going back to the Eagles, but the Eagles just re-signed Devin Allen. I don't know if you remember him.
The speedster. He broke the record in the hurdles.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if maybe he could be fielding punts or kicks. I don't know. That'd be cool.
I remember talking about that last year when we were talking about his speed, and he didn't have a lot of returns in college, but like we were like, hey, when you have that speed, I mean, we kind of had something similar happen at our alma mater, Marist, last year, where we had a kid who was on the track team, was one of the fastest kids on the track team, and the football team, he had eligibility. He played on the football team and was primarily their return man, and even got the ball out of the backfield a little bit. So I mean, you never know what these coaching staffs can do with guys, but I mean, the fact that they had Devin Allen last year and they bring him back, it is interesting they decided to do that. Yeah, no,
that's I don't know if they will do anything with it, but maybe he's practice squad again this year. That's probably what will end up happening. But hey, maybe, just try him out and see what happens. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But
so be it. So why don't we get into how do you want to do the defensive backs? We want to kind of do the safeties first, and then we'll do the corners after?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right, I feel like it'll be more organized. All right, so you let her rip that way.
All right, so safeties. I mean, oh my goodness, a wholesale of changes. Oh my goodness, so many different players in that room. Sort of going back to what we said earlier and what you said in the last episode, sort of just throwing things at the wall, seeing what sticks. So obviously, I feel like there's a lot of connections, Eagles Steelers wide, or at least a couple. Miles Jack was one, Terrell Edmonds, another one. Listed as the starting strong safety from not the official depth chart because the Eagles haven't released theirs yet, but another one that I found. Sidney Brown, their 2023 third rounder, and I think I said this last episode that I absolutely love how hard he hits.
Oh yeah,
Obviously,
you started to compare him to Brian Dawkins a little bit.
yeah.
I haven't forgotten that.
Yeah, please remind me constantly on that one, but only in that aspect. Um, no, but actually, his training camp's been rather quiet. I've seen him. I mean, he's been with the second team more, a few first team reps, but I believe those have gone more to Edmonds. And I mean, I don't really expect him to start right away either. I think he's going to be more of that backup sort of rotation safety, at least to start. I know he's a bit inconsistent when it comes to tackling, maybe because he's always trying to truck the defend or the offensive player. But yeah, so that's certainly one aspect that's very important that will need to be worked on as training camp continues, and I guess throughout. The other one, Justin Evans, who the Eagles signed from the Saints on a 1-year deal. Again, sort of just seeing how that plays out. I'm not really sure. I mean, he's also had a quiet camp too. I haven't really seen anything on him from what I've read, at least. I'm always looking at training camp notes. I swear I never see some of these players come up once. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. Maybe that's just fine. But the fact that he hasn't been bad is good. But the fact that he hasn't stood out in a good way either is like,
Yeah.
okay. So kind of a mystery there with him. And but sort of moving on to free safety, Reed Blankenship, the last year undrafted rookie. Yeah, so he's at the moment slated to start there. Showed pretty good potential. Obviously inconsistent, especially because he's undrafted. That's totally expected. But and then in this year, Kayvon Wallace, who's I swear for the last 2 seasons, we've just been saying that he might be cut at some point. He's really the only competition, and then Tristan McCullum, who I have no idea was before I looked this up. He was from the Texans. It's in his second year. I mean, if that's your competition, I'm sorry, but
Well, I was going to ask you this because it feels like the vibe that I'm getting from everything I've read with like just Eagles writers and everything is that like Reed Blankenship is kind of like, it's not that he hasn't earned it, but it's just like he's getting the job by default almost,
That's exactly what I was about to say. I was like, it kind of like that's your competition, a dude who I feel like has been on the fringe of the roster. It probably might get cut this year. I don't know. He's had a pretty solid or okay-ish camp. Kayvon Wallace, McCollum, again, no idea who that is. But
Yeah.
if that's your competition at least free safety, then yeah.
Barring any injuries, I like Terrell Edmonds. You know what you're getting from him. He was a solid player. That's what he is. Do you think that it's going to be Edmonds and Blankenship, barring any injury to start the season until Sidney Brown supplants someone or like, is that just where the Eagles are going at the safety position until something otherwise happens? Or, could you see them potentially bringing in someone, around the time when cuts start to happen? I mean, they brought CJ Gardner-Johnson in. I don't know if he was in by this time of camp last year, if it was later after some preseason games has already been played. But do you see a move coming, or is this kind of what it is? I mean, if this is what it is, it's not worst case scenario, but
it's not ideal though.
Not ideal.
I mean, if I'm going off of Howie Roseman's track record with all the, I feel like he's never complacent. He never stays put. It's always like, there's always room to improve the roster somehow, and I feel like this is the one position, apart from punter, that he'll definitely improve on. Let
me ask you this: what would you prefer? Another safety along the lines of a Terrell Edmonds like caliber player, or a mid-tier punter?
I think at this point I'd rather take another safety. I'm not gonna.
Okay, all right,
It's
fair
not
enough,
that
fair enough,
bad.
fair enough. I
I
mean, if
don't
you had
think
gone
it's
the other way, I also wouldn't have been like, I would have understood where you're coming from as well. So
I mean, it's a valid question considering how annoyed or how frustrated I was. No, but I think bringing in at least maybe another veteran. I mean, Justin Evans really isn't all that. I mean, he's been in the league for a few years now.
yeah,
And McCollum, like I said, only his second year. Blankenship, his second year. Wallace, I mean, his third or fourth year, but irrelevant, really not that good. Um, so I feel like it definitely could use another body in there, another veteran. I mean, someone at least to compete with them. I feel like the others just, well, at least Wallace and McCollum just aren't really going to compete with Reed Blankenship. So, um, yeah, I mean, obviously those losses of CJ Gardner Johnson and Marcus Epps are going to sting. And I mean, I just hope that this group, if this is the group that we stick with, at least the four, uh, Edmonds, Brown, Wallace, Blankenship, if those are the four we go in with, then at least I hope they're just competent, like at least average.
yeah.
I don't know. That's kind of what I expect from them right now.
I get that. I get that. All right, so let me talk about the Steelers safeties a little bit. Um, so obviously Minka Fitzpatrick. I mean, he's the
Yeah.
guy. Yeah, I mean, you can make the case he's the best safety in football. I mean, I will say that I believe he's the best safety in football. I mean, we talked when we did this preview last year about the fact that he was coming off a season where he had, I think it was like 124 tackles, which was a monstrous career high for him
Yeah, that's crazy.
prior to any other season. And, that was because the Steelers' run defense was so bad. Steelers' run defense wasn't great last year, but it greatly improved. His tackle numbers came down to 96. He had just 5 missed tackles on the season, which I thought was really impressive.
Yeah.
And he had 6 interceptions, which led the league. And he was a first-team All-Pro according to AP, and he was a Pro Bowler as well. So really had one of his best seasons. He was actually voted 10th in the Defensive Player of the Year voting as well, which I didn't even realize at the time. So he ended up being ranked 18th in NFL Network's, top 100 and everything recently.
Yeah.
So, the guy is just an absolute stud. I feel like there's not really more I have to say as far as expectations go for this year. I mean, the only thing I've even thought of that concerns me a little bit is like, he's played the last, his whole career in Pittsburgh, he's played alongside Terrell Edmonds. Now that he's not alongside Terrell Edmonds, and like I said, Terrell Edmonds is no flashy player, no great star in the NFL, but he's a very solid, reliable, dependable guy that you know what you're going to get from him. And now that Fitzpatrick is changing that up a little bit, I wonder how that dynamic shifts at all and if it affects his game at all. But Fitzpatrick is going to be relied a lot on in this, in the secondary because of the way the corners are kind of a lot of new faces. And now you've got DeMonte Casey, who's going to have a bigger role, and Keanu Neal, who was brought in free agency. Like, I don't know if we're going to see, Minka Fitzpatrick I think we're going to see him in a lot of different roles throughout the season is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. I think the interception numbers will still be there. I think the tackle numbers, I don't know if he's going to get up into the, 90s, 100s again, but I'd be surprised if he still wasn't up above, 75 into the 80s. And I still expect him to be, at the end of the day, the same very impactful player, even if he's doing it in a bunch of different ways.
Yeah, no, he certainly will. I mean, he's just that good. He's definitely up there for top safeties. And he's probably been the most available one. I mean, thinking of other safeties like Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, who've kind of been, or last year at least, were banged up. But yeah, no, that's that's a great player to have there in your secondary. I mean, obviously losing Edmonds is going to hurt. But at the end of the day, I think they're going to figure it out. And I'm really curious to see the strong safety position, which I know you're going to get into, but and see who takes that position, or if it's going to be more of a shared sort of position or rotation, if you will. But
yeah, I mean, I think last year was Minka Fitzpatrick's best year you can make the case for his career, I think, in his time with the Steelers. But this year, I think maybe the year he's the most dependent on, because of the high profile player he is and what you just talked about. I mean, this strong safety group, I could see the Steelers deploying the 3 safety technique a lot. I've talked about that in volume before on this podcast, but Demonte Casey's been hurt for part of training camp. Like Keanu Neal has been dealing with some nagging injuries. So it's like we haven't gotten an opportunity to actually see all three of these guys on the field together and really, work it into that kind of schematic. So, as far as, and obviously I'll get into the corners a little bit later, but there's turnover there. So I think what the Steelers get from Fitzpatrick in the secondary is going to be so important that I'm not even necessarily looking at his stats so much because like he proved it last year. Like the interception numbers went back up. The tackle numbers were still at a respectable number, and he wasn't putting on his body on the line as much as he was 2 seasons ago when he was in the 120s for tackles. So, he's the do-it-all guy, and in my opinion, he's the second most important player on this defense behind T.J. Watt, and I think that'll be the same thing again. My expectation for the short safety position, I mean, Demonte Casey actually had a pretty solid year last year. He was graded as an 81 on PFF, and he had 2 interceptions in the 9 games he played. So alongside Keanu Neal, I mean, I think as long as just one of those 2 guys is healthy and dependable, like that's what the Steelers really have to rely on. And if they can make it work where all 3 are healthy and you can deploy that 3 safety look, I'll be really happy about it. And, I'm not as adamant about the 3 safety look as I once was because I feel more confident in the inside linebacker group now than I did during the offseason. And just what I've seen through training camp so far, I have faith in that inside linebacker group. But really just more in the secondary sense, I'm just looking for dependability out of one of these guys, more or less. And, outside of those 3, what else the Steelers have there? I mean, Trey Norwood was an undrafted rookie 2 years ago. And, this is his 3rd season now, and he's had a pretty solid camp. Kenny Robinson, a name I mentioned earlier, is leading camp with 3 interceptions. So we'll see if he can continue to, fight for a roster spot. And Miles Killebrew is a guy that's probably going to make the roster for no other reason than special teams.
I was about to say Killebrew probably for special teams, but
yeah. So yeah. I like what the Steelers have. I think it's a step back from what they had last year with Terrell Edmunds, but they can still make this work with the collective group that they have there among those 6 players I just talked about.
Do you have any projected stats for Casey or for Keanu Neal, or just? You're not really
it's interesting because like the thing with Casey is he only played 9 games. He only had 20 tackles, but he still had an 81 PFF grade, which kind of is what stood out to me.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'd like for him to play in more than 9 games. I mean, I know he started the season injured. So, I mean, if he can make it healthy, that's the guy that I'm kind of leaning on more. And to me, it's more of like Keanu Neal. Anything you can get from him is a bonus. He had 63 tackles last year. I mean, if he gives the Steelers anywhere from, 50 to 80 tackles, I'm going to be a very happy camper. So, and that's because he is that more of an aggressive type of safety who's physical and likes to play down in the box. But, he hasn't been the same player since his first 2 years with the Falcons. And I'm not expecting him to really be anything more than that rotational in the box safety that can kind of rotate along with Casey and be that 3 safety combination. So that's what the Steelers have at safety. And yeah, I'm feeling not optimistic, but I'm feeling comfortable with what they have.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think they'd bring anyone else in, maybe another veteran after roster cuts, or this?
I don't really see it. I think this is kind of what it is at this point. Maybe if the right situation arose, but I think that this is pretty much what it's going to be.
Yeah, that's valid. So should we move on?
Let's move over to corner now, and I'll let you start off with the Eagles again.
All right. Well, I'm going to say the one person who's not making the roster, Greedy Williams, as I said, is going to be in the roster cuts. But yeah. So, and I also already mentioned these players: Darius Slay, James Bradbury, Avonte Maddox. I mean, Maddox. I'm crossing my fingers, stays healthy because when he is one of the best slot corners in the league.
No doubt about it.
Oh man, I love watching him play too. I mean, I just remember that Dallas game. He was playing so well, and then he injured his toe on that one really good tackle he had. Just man. But yeah, I mean, name a better trio in the NFL, cornerback trio. Oh wait.
Yeah, you really can't. And I mean, as long as you don't see any regression from Slayer Bradbury when it comes to age, like that is as good as it gets among 3 corners. And that's what the Eagles put their value on rather than safety when it comes to where they invested in the secondary.
Yeah, which I think is probably the smart move because you need corners. You need those guys who can line up against those receivers, those physical guys. Really, I mean, these guys have been in the league for a while. So I mean, Darius Slay, I forget what number he was. He was James Bradbury wasn't even the top 100, which is ridiculous on the NFL list. But
Yeah, and he was second team All Pro last year.
yes, exactly. So I'm like, all right, fine. Just keep sleeping on him. That's totally fine. Interception numbers for both of them, at least. I mean, like I don't really pay much attention to that. I don't think
Mhm.
it's that big a deal. Obviously, the like
Both
big
of them
play
had both of
Slay.
them had 3 last year. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I was gonna
do
say
you
it's
think
like
that?
3 or
I mean,
4.
yeah, I mean, that's if you're getting 3 or 4 as a corner, like that's a pretty solid season.
Yeah, in the NFL nowadays, it's like, yeah, like, but big play Slay, I feel like his usually came at big moments in the season. Yeah, 2 against the Vikings. That was one of my favorite moments of the season. But yeah, so at least the starting trio totally fine. Those I'm not worried about them. Hopefully, no injuries happen there on that front. But it gets more interesting after, like in terms of depth. Keely Ringo, um, someone who was projected to go earlier than he did. I mean, he's also kind of had a quiet camp, but I guess again
I was
that's a
gonna ask you if you've
fine
heard
thing.
anything about him.
Yeah, I haven't
Just
read
like
seen his name really pop up.
Mhm.
So other than him being with the second team, so I mean that's totally fine. Well, he's not expected to start right away anyway. So as long as he can be, one of those, I mean, backup positions, which he will be. He's not going to get cut. I don't assume, but um, that's totally fine. He's not going to be thrusted into the lineup. There's no need for that. He'll just keep learning behind those three. And then I said Josh Jobe, of course, who's it seems like is really taking a stranglehold on that top backup position, the top outside corner position, and then Zach McPherson, who's been on this roster for the past 3 years. Looks like he'll be backing up Avante Maddox, as I said before, too. But then Josiah Scott, I actually forgot about him for when I was doing this. I was like, man, what happened to him? But again, quiet camp hasn't really stood out negatively or positively. So I mean, he was forced to play a few games, I believe, filling in for Avante Maddox last season. So
Mhm.
and he looked okay. But again, it's only his second year now. So
Yeah,
I, I
and I mean the depth I feel like is something that we're gonna get more of an indication on as we go through the preseason games. I guess the only question I have for you, and I know you haven't heard a lot about Keely Ringo, but I think just the fact too, I mean, there's a lot of experts out there who've said like he's a guy who could probably transition to safety. I mean, do you have any
hmm.
interest in that? I mean, it could be something that makes sense because he's got the prowess as a tackler, and a lot of experts said that his better games in college was when he was facing the play and not kind of chasing a receiver downfield.
I mean, you could certainly try it. It's not like it's gonna harm him necessarily. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, is what I'm saying. But again, I kind of go back to what I said before. I feel like they need to bring in another veteran, someone who's like been playing the position for a good chunk of their career.
Yeah.
So I think the Eagles are probably better off bringing in someone else. But yeah, if you want to try him out at safety, yeah, that's fine with me. You got other quality backups there. It's not like he's gonna. I mean, like, what's the worst that can happen really at this point in time? Because he's not going to start, and I mean, at this point, it's still training camp. It's still preseason, so you could do it. You could try it out.
Yeah, no, certainly. And I mean, I think the one thing with the Eagles here in the secondary is their depth at corner is definitely more evident than at safety. I think that the depth is definitely a strength of this position group.
Definitely, and also younger, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So, are there any other kind of expectations you have, or should I move on to the Steelers now?
No, that's all I got. Let's go with the Steelers.
All right, let's close things out with the Steelers cornerbacks here. I mean, the first big thing is Patrick Peterson. Had a really solid season last year with Minnesota, and still kind of even as he's getting up there in age, and kind of on the backside of his career, he's showing he is still a solid player. I mean, that's what this position group really comes down to. I mean, because you have Joey Porter here, the kid that I talked in volumes about earlier on this podcast. I'm not going to get into that again, but it's still a question whether he's going to truly be ready to go from the start. So, there's a lot of pressure on Patrick Peterson here to kind of replicate, I would think at least replicate what he's done the past 2 years in Minnesota. because you lose out now on Cameron Sutton, who the Steelers decided not to re-sign in the offseason. I mean, Sutton was a guy who had 3 interceptions last year, and his best of his career low, 47.9 completion percentage against. So that was a really good player, and he also played just as many snaps on defense as anybody. I mean, I could have made the case he was the third most important player to the Steelers team on the defensive side of the ball, outside of T.J. Watt and Minkah Fitzpatrick. And that's saying something over some of these other ballers on defense. So big shoes for Patrick Peterson to fill. Outside of him, there's Levi Wallace, who really had a good year last year. His career high in interceptions with 4, pretty standard as far as his tackles went. And, I think if he can kind of replicate again what he did last season of just be that really solid number 2 corner, I'm looking for him to get maybe 2 interceptions and still be in kind of that 50 tackle range and, kind of have a completion percentage against below 60. I'd see that as a good season and kind of replicating what he did last year. I felt like he really kind of ascended in the back half of the year, maybe struggled a little bit in the new system, new team to begin the year, but I felt like he really closed the year strong, and I'm optimistic he can continue that into next year. Outside of those guys, I mean, the Steelers have really kind of had a rotating door at slot corner since Mike Hilton left in free agency to go to the Bengals. So this year they brought in Chandon Sullivan, who's played, with a multitude of different teams. He had 60 tackles last year, but he's never really been anything special. And then there's a couple other guys, Elijah Riley and Duke Dawson, who they've tried out in that slot corner role. They've said that if Joey Porter Jr. is ready to play on the outside, they'll move Patrick Peterson into slot corner when they're in the nickel or the dime. So something to keep in mind with that. So I'm not as crazy about the depth here. And the Steelers' depth at corner really got hurt when Corey Trice Jr., who was a big, long corner, he was a late-round pick this year. He tore his ACL, I believe it was last week during camp. So he was out, and that really kind of thinned the Steelers out and, opened the door for a guy like James Pierre, who's kind of, to me, he's like the equivalent of like Kayvon Wallace, a guy who every year you talk about, is he going to get cut this year? And he still continues to find a way onto the roster and still ends up playing snaps on defense. That to me is the equivalent. I mean, he didn't have per se a bad year, but I mean, not a guy I want seeing the field a lot. But so the depth isn't crazy here. I think if anything, we could maybe see the Steelers go after a veteran signing here rather than safety. So that's how I see things shaking out in the corner room for the Steelers this year.
Yeah, I also, just going back to Elijah Riley, I read something, I think yesterday, that he's been making plays in training camp. So I don't know, but have you seen anything on that? Because that's like he's been doing pretty well.
He's not a guy that's jumped off the page, but he's definitely like I want Elijah Riley to be better than Chandon Sullivan. Like if he can be better than Chandon Sullivan and be that slot corner, on running downs, that would be ideal to me. So, I mean, he's got experience as a safety, so I feel like that transition is almost natural to the slot corner and, being able to tackle on those rundowns. So if he could do that, that would be fantastic. And then, that would make Chandon Sullivan pretty expendable.
Right.
I would very much like that if that was kind of the direction the Steelers decided to go. And I hope that Riley can, continue to kind of build on that. It hasn't been anything spectacular, but I'm glad you did bring him up.
Yeah, no, because that was one of the things I read. I was like, oh, yeah, that's cool to see. That's a good sign.
And I think he was with the Jets in 2021, and then the Steelers didn't sign him until like around this time of training camp last year, and he did enough, I think, to stick with the practice squad all through last year. And now he's really kind of pushing for a roster spot. So we'll see if he can make it. I feel like even with an injury, he might have gotten onto the roster at some point last year. I don't remember for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd like to see him continue to push.
One last thing for you. I mean, I would imagine this excites you. Like the thought of going back to Joey Porter Jr., like him starting like immediately. And
it does excite me. I'm not gonna lie. It's rare when you can really find a shutdown corner that like you can get excited about. And again, I'm not trying to put that label on Joey Porter Jr., but like how promising he's looked in camp, and the Steelers still don't really plan on even starting him at the beginning of the season. But like if he is good enough that he could potentially be, a starter come week 1, I do get excited about that possibility. I get excited when you draft a corner as early as they did Joey Porter, that maybe, he could be that guy, because that's certainly a player that's coveted by every NFL team.
Yeah, no, for sure. That'd be a great sign, a great thing to see if that happens. But yeah,
So, Ricardo, I think one last thing we should do before we close things out here. We're closing in on an hour and a half here of this episode, but there's a lot to talk about right now, and especially because it's been a week and a half since our last episode. But I think we gotta, for special teams, for safeties, and for corners, we have to decide which of the two teams has the better group, like we did last year. I don't see any reason to not do it.
yeah, let's do it.
So,
all right.
Yeah, let's start with special teams. I mean, where do you lean on it?
This dreaded punter situation is
this is tougher than last year, because the punters are both pretty bad, but the Steelers did bring in someone to compete with Presley
Harvin. And I think Boswell's going to have a bounce back year. That's just. I'm going to give it to the Steelers as of right now.
Okay, I'm not going to argue that. We had decided to go Eagles. I wouldn't have been opposed to it because of how consistent Jake Elliott was, even though he had the limited field goal opportunities. But I mean, CPOS is rough right now. And I feel like the kick returners is kind of a push. So, all right, special teams goes to the Steelers. I'm cool with that.
Sweet.
Safety. I personally think it's the Steelers, just because you have such a dynamic player in Fitzpatrick.
Absolutely. I mean, him alone, yeah. It's just better than the sum of the Eagles players on safety, at least.
And you outlined, it feels like they still need to bring in another player before this room is ready for the regular season.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. Just as long as it's not Jaquiski Tart.
Oh, God. Oh, no, not that name again.
All right, and then I feel like corner, it's pretty clear cut. I mean, that's got to go to the Eagles. I mean, we talked about it. The Steelers, it's a rookie, it's an aging Patrick Peterson, and it's middle of the pack Levi Wallace versus arguably the best trio of corners in football. So there's no conversation there.
Yeah, that's pretty straightforward on that front. So 2-1
all right, man.
Steelers.
Well, all right. I think that just about does it for us. I'm getting hungry. I got to go get some dinner. I don't know about you.
Oh, man, I got to finish packing before I head off to vacation tomorrow.
Hell yes. Enjoy that. You have fun. That's awesome. I didn't know you were going on vacation, so you have a great time.
Thanks, man. Enjoy your dinner.
Dude. All right, bro. I hope to see you soon. And yeah, we'll continue to talk Steelers and Eagles as stuff continues to develop. Throughout the rest of training camp. In our next episode, we'll potentially have some, one, depending on when we do it, maybe 2 preseason games that we can look back on and pull stuff from. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of more news to break down. So until then, we will see you next time. We've been Speaking Steagles. Peace out, everybody.